Number 25. Forgotten money tricks Depression-era farmers never told their children. In the autumn of 1933, a corn farmer named Henry Albrecht stood at the edge of 80 acres in Cass County, Nebraska, and watched the price of his crop fall to 10 cents a bushel. It had been 80 cents 3 years earlier. He had a wife, 6 children, and a mortgage held by a bank that had already failed once that year. His cash income for all of 1933 came to $211. He paid the interest. He fed 8 people. He did not lose the farm. By the time he died in 1961, the 80 acres were paid off free and clear, and he had never borrowed another dollar in his life. His neighbors assumed he had found money somewhere. He had not. What he had was a set of rules his own father had drilled into him during the Panic of 1893, rules Henry never bothered to write down because he assumed his children already knew them. They did not. We forgot all of it. We forgot what those farmers knew at the bottom of the worst economy this country has ever produced. We forgot that the men who kept their land through the Dust Bowl were not lucky and were not subsidized. They were precise. We replaced their precision with credit lines and crop insurance and called it security, and then we wondered why a bad year now ends a family that a bad decade could not end then. Number 22 on this list cost a Depression farmer nothing and was later confirmed by agricultural economists to be the single most protective habit a small farm could practice. Number 11 was so ordinary in 1934 that no one thought it worth mentioning, and a modern university study now calls it a forgotten cornerstone of financial resilience. And number 1, the rule Henry Albrecht enforced more strictly than any other, is the reason a $211 income paid a mortgage that should have swallowed the farm whole. These 25 tricks were not about being poor. They were about a refusal to break. If you want to understand the architecture of that unbreakable life, subscribe now, and let us count down the 25 forgotten money tricks Depression-era farmers never told their children. Number 25. The seed saved before the meal. A farmer in 1932 set aside next year's seed before he fed his own family from the harvest. The best ears of corn, the fullest heads of wheat, the strongest seed potatoes never reached the table. They went into the seed crib first, and only what remained became food. A farmer in Iowa who ate his seed in a hungry winter had no crop the following spring and no farm the following fall. The temptation was real. A bushel of seed corn was also a bushel of meal, and a hungry family looked at the seed crib the way a drowning man looks at a plank. But the farmer who broke into the seed had borrowed against a spring he had not yet reached, and the interest was the whole next year. The seed was not surplus. The seed was next year, and next year always ate first. Number 24. The 2-furrow rule. A farmer never planted his entire acreage in a single crop. He split it. Corn on one field, oats on another, a kitchen garden, and a hog lot besides. When the corn price collapsed in 1933, the oats held. When the oats failed to a wet spring, the hogs carried the year. A man in Kansas who planted everything in wheat in 1931 was wiped out in a single bad harvest. The man beside him who split his ground survived. It was not caution. It was a refusal to let one bad season be the last one. Number 23. The hog that paid the taxes. A Depression farmer kept hogs not because pork was profitable, but because a hog converted scraps, spoiled grain, and garden waste into cash that arrived exactly when the tax bill did. A sow farrowed twice a year. A litter of 8 pigs raised on kitchen waste and field gleanings sold in the fall for enough to cover the county property tax with a little left for boots. A farmer in Missouri called his hogs the only employees on the place who never asked for wages and always paid the government. A hog needed almost nothing a farm did not already throw away. The skim milk left after the cream was sold, the corn too poor to market, the windfall apples, the kitchen scraps, the whey, the weeds pulled from the garden rows. All of it went through the hog and came out as money in the fall. The hog was not livestock. The hog was the tax collector's man, working for free in the back lot. Number 22. The cull before the cost. A Depression farmer culled his herd and his flock without sentiment. The hen that stopped laying went into the soup pot. The cow that gave thin milk was sold before she ate another winter's hay. A man in Indiana kept a record from 1930 to 1936 of every animal he culled and what it would have cost to feed an unproductive one through the cold months. The total ran to hundreds of dollars in feed, never wasted. Agricultural economists at land-grant colleges later confirmed what the farmers already knew, that carrying an unproductive animal through winter was the fastest way a small farm bled itself dry. The cull was not cruelty. It was the refusal to feed something that had stopped feeding you. Number 21. The egg and cream money. The hens and the milk cow belonged by custom to the farm wife, and the money they brought was hers to manage. A dozen eggs traded at the Crossroads store for coffee, salt, and thread. A few gallons of cream sent to the creamery brought a check that never touched the husband's hands. A woman in South Dakota in 1934 ran the entire household on egg and cream money and never once spent $1 of the crop income on groceries. The eggs were not pocket change. They were the grocery budget, laid fresh every morning before breakfast.
Number 20. The mended harness. A leather harness cost $14 new in 1933. A farmer who could punch a rivet, stitch a strap, and oil the leather kept a harness running for 20 years. A man in Nebraska repaired the same set of work harness from 1928 to 1951, replacing only the buckles. His neighbor bought new every 5 years. Across 20 years, the difference was $42, which in 1933 was a month of a family's living. The harness was not equipment. The harness was a bill the saddle shop never got to send. Number 19. The cellar that fed February. Every farmhouse had a root cellar, and the summer garden was planted with the cellar in mind, not the table. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, cabbages, and onions went down into the cool dark in October. Jars of beans, tomatoes, and corn lined the shelves. A family in Ohio in 1932 ate from its own cellar from the first frost until the first lettuce of spring without buying a single vegetable. The work was done in summer when no one was hungry, against a winter when everyone would be. The wife who filled 200 jars in August was not canning food. She was canning January, and she knew it as she sealed each lid. The garden was not a hobby. The garden was the difference between a winter spent eating and a winter spent owing. Number 18. The borrowed bull. No small farmer owned a bull. A bull ate like 3 cows and worked a few weeks a year. Instead, neighbors shared one, paying the owner $1 or a day's labor per service. A community of a dozen farms in Wisconsin in 1935 kept one good bull among them and saved each family the cost and feed of an animal none of them needed to own. The shared bull was not generosity. It was a herd of cattle financed without anyone buying the most expensive animal on it. Number 17. The sharpened plow.
A plowshare that was kept sharp pulled easier, and a plow that pulled easier saved the horses, and horses that were spared lasted longer and ate less. A farmer in Minnesota dressed his plowshares on a grindstone every few days during plowing season. His team worked a full life and never foundered. The neighbor who plowed with dull iron wore out a horse in half the years. The sharp edge was not vanity. It was the health of a $150 team protected with a few minutes at the grindstone. Number 16. The woodlot worked in winter. A farm with even a few acres of timber heated itself for free. In the dead of winter, when the fields were frozen and there was no crop work, the farmer cut, split, and stacked the next year's firewood. A family in Pennsylvania spent not 1 cent on heat for 30 years because the woodlot was worked every January. The standing timber was not scenery. It was the fuel bill, paid in advance with labor that would otherwise have sat idle by the stove.
Number 15. The threshing ring. At harvest, neighbors formed a threshing ring, moving as a single crew from farm to farm with one shared threshing machine until every crop was in. No farm hired outside labor. No farm bought its own machine. A ring of 15 farms in North Dakota in 1934 brought in the entire neighborhood's grain on shared labor alone, an exchange worth hundreds of dollars per farm that never required a dollar to change hands. The women cooked for the crews in turn, and the threshing dinner became the social event of the late summer. A table of fried chicken and pie laid out for 30 men who had just put in another farm's harvest. The work was shared, the machine was shared, and the cash that a hired crew would have demanded stayed in every farmer's pocket. The threshing ring was not a favor. It was a harvest crew the whole community owned, and no one paid. Number 14. The patched and turned clothing. A farm wife unpicked a worn man's coat, turned the cloth to its unfaded inside, and resewed it into a coat that looked new. Outgrown trousers were let down at the hem. Worn shirts became boys' shirts, then patches, then rags, then rag rugs. A mother in Texas in 1933 clothed a family of 7 on under $9 of cash for the year. The cloth was not used up when it wore through. It was begun again, a second time and a third, until nothing remained but the rug on the floor. Number 13. The barter ledger. A farmer who had no cash still had labor, eggs, milk, and surplus produce, and he traded all of it. He shot the blacksmith's horse in exchange for the blacksmith fixing his cultivator. He gave the schoolteacher a side of pork in exchange for boarding her through the term. A man in Arkansas in 1934 conducted nearly the whole business of his life without coin, tracking it all in a small ledger of who owed whom. The barter was not desperation. It was an economy that kept running after the cash had run out. Number 12. The land before the comfort. For a Depression farmer, the mortgage came before everything. Before new furniture, before a better wagon, before any comfort the family wanted, the payment on the land was made. A farmer in Colorado in 1932 slept on a straw tick and drove a wagon held together with wire so that the deed would one day be clean. He bought 60 acres in 1919 and owned every inch of it by 1940. A man who owned his land could not be put off it. The land was not an investment, it was the floor under the family. And a farmer kept the floor solid before he worried about the walls.
In 1933, the average American farm earned a cash income of roughly $400 a year, and across the worst of the Depression, foreclosure swept through the countryside like weather. But the farms that survived shared something the statistics finally caught up to decades later. A study of Depression-era farm survival found that the families who kept their land were almost never the ones with the most acreage or the best soil. They were the ones who had diversified their income across crops, livestock, and a garden, who carried little or no consumptive debt, and who could feed themselves entirely from their own ground. Income did not save a farm. Self-sufficiency saved a farm. The man who could eat without buying, heat without buying, and clothe his children without buying, needed almost no cash at all, and a family that needs almost no cash cannot be starved out by a bad price. The bankers of 1933 did not understand this. The farmers never explained it. They simply kept their land and let the auctioneer pass them by. The men who lost everything were not lazy and were not foolish. Many of them had borrowed in the good years of the 1920s to buy more ground at high prices, betting that the prices would hold, and when the prices fell, the debt did not fall with them. The survivors had made the opposite bet. They had assumed the good years were temporary and the bad years were coming, and they had built a farm that needed almost nothing from the outside world. When the bad years arrived, the gamblers were exposed, and the careful were merely inconvenienced. Number 11. The account book read every Sunday. Every Depression farm kept a book, and it was not a budget. It was a record of every dollar in and every dollar out, written by hand and read aloud at the kitchen table on Sunday evening. A farmer in Illinois reviewed his book every week for 40 years and could tell you in March what the year would cost by December. A modern university study of household financial resilience now calls regular self-review a forgotten cornerstone of staying solvent, the single habit most predictive of a family weathering a shock. The farmers did it by lamplight in 1934. The book did not judge. It only told the truth, and the farmer who read it every Sunday was never surprised by his own life. Number 10. The thing fixed before it was bought. A broken hinge, a cracked singletree, a leaking boot, a split axe handle. The Depression farmer fixed all of it before he ever considered buying new. A toolbox in the corner of the barn held a few files, a soldering iron, wire, leather scraps, and a forge for heating iron. A man in Georgia repaired nearly everything that broke on his place for 25 years and bought a replacement only when the thing could not be saved. The repair did not have to be pretty. It had to last one more season. The fix was a refusal to pay a town price for a problem a farmer could solve himself.
Number 9. The cash bought, never the credit. The country store offered credit, and the Depression farmer used it as little as he possibly could. He knew that the store credit that carried a family through a lean spring was the same credit that took the farm when the price did not recover. A farmer in Tennessee in 1932 walked away from the store with an empty sack rather than open an account, and ate cornmeal until the cream check came. By 1940, he owned his land. The neighbor who lived on store credit owned the store's good opinion and nothing else. The cash rule was not pride. It was a wall against the slow foreclosure that began at the store counter. Number 8. The lard that did the work of 3. A hog rendered down to lard gave a farm wife the only cooking fat she needed for a year, and she used it for everything. It fried the eggs, shortened the biscuits, greased the wagon axle, sealed the canned meat, and made the soap. A woman in Kentucky in 1933 bought no cooking fat, no axle grease, and no soap because the hog she had already raised supplied all 3. The lard was not waste fat. It was 3 or 4 bills the family never paid, rendered out of an animal they already owned. Number 7. The children who earned their keep.
On a Depression farm, a child worked from the time he could carry a bucket. A boy of 10 managed the chickens. A girl of 12 ran the garden rows. By 14, they did the work of a hired hand. A farmer in Oklahoma in 1934 ran a 120-acre place with no paid labor at all because his 5 children were the labor, integrated into the real economy of the family from the time they could walk a row. There was no allowance and no chore chart. The work was simply the family's survival, and every child understood by the age of 8 that the eggs they gathered and the wood they carried were not tasks invented to keep them busy. They were the reason the family ate. The children were not free hands. They were a farm being handed down in advance, learning at 10 the work they would own at 30. Number 6. The seed catalog studied, never obeyed. The seed and equipment catalogs arrived full of temptation, and the Depression farmer read them like a man reads a map of a country he will never visit. He learned the prices. He noted what improved and what was a gimmick, and he bought almost nothing, because he had already decided that desire printed on glossy paper was the most expensive thing in the mail. A farmer in Indiana kept his catalogs for the information and burned the order forms. The catalog was not a store, it was a test, and the farmer passed it every season by closing the cover. Number 5. The buy once tool. A Depression farmer bought the best tool he could afford one time and maintained it for a lifetime. A good axe, a good plow, a good cream separator. A cast iron stove bought in 1925 in a farmhouse in Vermont was still in service in 1970. The equivalent cheap stove replaced every decade would have cost 3 times as much across the same years. The farmer did not distrust new things out of stubbornness. He had done the arithmetic on old things and found it favorable. Buy once, buy well, and maintain it until it cannot be maintained. Number 4. The auction before the loan. Before a Depression farmer borrowed $1, he first sold what he no longer needed. A widow in Idaho who needed $150 to repair a barn roof held a farm sale first and raised most of it from machinery she had stopped using, borrowing only the small remainder from a son. The unused implement rusting in the fence row was not an asset. It was a loan she had not yet been forced to take. The auction was the cheapest financing on the place because it charged no interest at all. Number 3. The wealth no one was allowed to see. No surviving Depression farmer ever let a neighbor know what he had. The man who had quietly paid off his land wore the same patched overalls as the man about to lose his. A farmer in Nebraska who held a clear deed and money in a sound bank drove the same wired-together wagon for 15 years. His father had told him a single sentence during the Panic of 1893, and Henry Albrecht's father had told him the same one. What they cannot see, they cannot take, and they cannot ask you for. The poor mouth was not deception. It was a fortress built out of the appearance of having nothing, and it kept the borrowing relatives, the smooth salesman, and the curious banker all on the far side of the gate. Number 2. The winter spent working. The Depression farmer did not stop in winter. When the fields were frozen and the crop was in, he repaired the machinery for spring, cut the next year's firewood, mended the harness and the fence, butchered and cured the meat, and ran a trap line or a workshop for cash. A farmer in Michigan earned nearly a third of his annual money in the months when the ground was hard because idle time was the only thing on a farm that produced nothing and cost everything. He ran a trap line along the creek for fur. He hauled timber to the mill. He hired his team out to neighbors who needed a load moved. The cold did not stop the work. It only changed it. The winter was not a rest. It was the season a careful farmer turned the dead months into the year's quiet profit. Number 1. Spend less than the land brings in. That is the whole rule. No seed crib, no threshing ring, no account book read on Sunday night. None of the 24 tricks above mean anything without this one beneath them. Henry Albrecht earned $211 in 1933. He spent $190. The $21 gap held and defended through the worst year any American farmer ever saw, paid the interest, fed 8 people, and kept 80 acres out of the bank's hands. Over a lifetime, that gap, held open every single year without exception, became a deed with no lien on it and a family that never went hungry. There was no trick beneath it. There was a gap. Henry held the gap open for 28 years, and the gap built everything. It is the most boring sentence anyone has ever spoken about money. It has always been the most important one.
None of these tricks required a good price, a kind banker, or a government check. They required attention. The willingness to look at a hard year honestly and decide that it would not be the last one. Henry Albrecht stood at the edge of his 80 acres in the autumn of 1933 and watched the price of his corn fall to almost nothing. And he did not panic, and he did not borrow, and he did not sell. He went back to the house, opened the book on the kitchen table, found the gap, and held it. He did that every year for the rest of his life, and when he died, the land was clean and the children were grown, and not one of them ever knew how close it had come, because he never told them, and they never thought to ask. The rules died with men like him, not because they were complicated, but because they were so plain that no one believed they needed saving. The seed crib is empty now. The threshing rings are gone. The account books were thrown out with the farmhouses. But the math did not die, and the gap is still there, waiting for anyone willing to do what Henry Albrecht did at the kitchen table on a cold night in 1933. Count what comes in. Set aside the gap, and refuse for as long as it takes to ever let it close. Before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. Was there a quiet money rule in your own family, a habit passed down from a grandparent or a parent that the rest of the world has forgotten? A way of stretching a dollar, of saving without saying so, of never being caught short? Leave it below. Somewhere in this comment section is a rule worth more than anything a bank will ever tell you. And the only way the rest of us will hear it is if you write it down.